Hi, hello.
Hello. Hi, I'm just double checking. I presume everyone can hear me. Great. If you can't hear me, please just type in the YouTube chat and let me know if you have issue with the audio quality. Cool, lovely. So, first of all, thank you all for listening in. There are only 4 of you right now, but anyhow, I'm going to be talking about the politics of China, and this is going to be roughly around 1 hour or so of a lecture, followed by Q&As, in which you're more than welcome to type in any questions on the question section on the YouTube video. But basically, I've also shared the link to the PowerPoint, so don't worry if you've missed or you're unable to listen to the entirety of this presentation. You're more than welcome to look at the presentation or the PPT afterwards. There are basically 4 parts to what I'm going to talk about today. 1, I want to talk about how we should understand China in general and how such understanding of China can be applied to debates in general. Secondly, I want to talk about China as an example of a wider phenomena, concepts, or trends. Effectively, when you want to use China to illustrate an argument or a point in debates, how are you going to do that, and what are the arguments you should know for that? Thirdly, I'm going to talk about Greater China, and talking about Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and also touching upon internal tensions and claims for autonomy or potential secessionist movements within China. And I'm not endorsing or condemning them. I'm just raising this as a disclaimer beforehand, just to clarify. And finally, I'm going to talk about China in the wider world, in which you might think that this might purely be about IR, and you're probably right, but there's also more to it than IR, because there's the international or intranational and organizational interactions that China has with its allies, enemies, and whatnot. So these are the overall gist of today's discussion. Let's start first with understanding China, on understanding China's history. Because I often feel that in terms of debates, the history of China is overlooked by debaters, and this can make or break what we call a nuanced characterization versus a generic but detailed and nonetheless adequate characterization of China. Being able to recite some sort of specific nouns about any topic probably is a sign that you're wary or aware of the nuances of the topic, and therefore is a good thing in general. But when it comes to China and debating China in particular, I would say proper nouns are not necessary, but incredibly useful in terms of establishing the authority on the matter. So what should we know when it comes down to history from China? Because obviously it's not productive of me to go through a lecture that covers the entirety of the 5,000 years or more of Chinese history, and that's not what I'm going to do. But I want to talk about Chinese history in terms of its relationship with contemporary political ideals, with certain motifs, but ultimately terms of reference that you might hear being thrown around in general discussions concerning Chinese politics, but also in debates about China as a whole. There are 4 key themes I'd like to cover. First, on the Pax Seneca. Second, on reaction to perceived colonialism and imperialism. Thirdly, on CCP between 1949 and 1976. And finally, on the history of the Communist Party from 1976 onwards, demarcated, of course, by the death of Mao Zedong. So let's start with the Pax Seneca, which you might guess correctly is effectively the Chinese counterpart to the more typically used or understood concept of the Pax Americana. So the Pax Seneca effectively, or in Chinese lingo, the 中华帝国, 中华文明, or in Chinese lingo, the 中华帝国, 中华文明, is an imaginary or political concept of China being the center of a global community, and the entirety of the world, the so-called Tianxia, would be subsumed under the sovereignty of China as its rightful pivot or the rightful heir to control over global territories. And this is a globalist worldview that was historically entrenched, initiated around 200 to 300 BC, but continued for around 2,000 years since. And until very recently, only during the CCP's earlier years, was still, only then was it dropped, but up until then, it was a very prominent theme and overtone in China's conception of foreign relations, of its place in relation to the world, but also of how governments ought to operate. And the gist of it is that not only is the world a part of a cynic sphere, that every and each corner of the world belongs to China, but more specifically, China is the rightful center of the world. And that's why the Chinese name for China is Zhongguo, which stands for the Central Kingdom, or the Middle Kingdom, the kingdom being situated within the center of the world. And this is important in understanding China's contemporary international relations outlook, because you can see, signs of this in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an economic project that tries to initiate through restoring the Silk Roads that were historical trade routes in the past, through restoring these routes, basically igniting new trade routes for China in connection with Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also Africa. So that's an example of where the Pax Sinica is currently being, replicated or implemented through foreign relations and policies internationally. You can also read up, a very nice introduction to this would be Kissinger's On China, but a more academic approach that might be Townsend 1992, where he talks about the imagination of contemporary Chinese nationalism and the links between that and the pre-modern sort of historical Chinese state and historical narratives. The second point I want to cover here is the concept of reaction to perceived colonialism and imperialism. Now, between the early 20th century and the 1949, say, when the CCP established communist China, the 50 years then were demarcated by incredible turbulence in which there were repeated attempts by various campaigns to institutionalize order and stability within China. Now, globally, World War I and World War II happened, but within China, the Sino-Japanese War was basically at the fore or the front of Chinese politics between late 1930s and 1950s. But the narratives that were used by a lot of the leaders in China then harked back to this concept of the century of humiliation. You might think, what exactly is a century of humiliation? Well, it's effectively the period of time between the late 18th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where China was subject to, at least from the eyes of Chinese nationalists and those who were fervently rooting for the Chinese nationalist cause, to foreign humiliation. And that is colonial forces or imperial forces that attempted to assert themselves through lots of channels, such as the trade in opium or the conquest and of particular historically important sites within Beijing and whatnot, attempted to shape Chinese politics and take over territories within China. And indeed, various treaties were signed. For instance, Hong Kong was ceded to the Brits through a series of treaties in the latter 50 years, or the earlier 50 years, sorry, of the 19th century. And therefore, there's a common thread that underpins Chinese nationalism today, which is reaction to perceived injustice and colonialism coming from the West. And you might say that this is a constructed understanding of history, but I guess this also evidences a wider point I want to illustrate about Chinese politics today, which is that the way we understand or narrate history from the eyes and points of views of Chinese politicians today are often done in a way that has contemporary political significance, i.e. the manners through which history is conveyed and taught to future generations in China, as with any other major power or country in the world, has an innate political bias. And the innate political bias here is the narrative or the frame of us versus the other, of China as the center reacting to the conquest and perceived interference of the West as the other. So I guess that is a framework through which we can understand how Chinese history is narrated and taught today, and how this also therefore shapes the outlook and worldview of both the leaders and politicians alike in that sense. Let's then talk about CCP's history very briefly between 1949 and 1976. So, the worldview of both the leaders and politicians alike in that sense. Let's then talk about CCP's history very briefly between 1949 and 1976. So, this is effectively a period where Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, whatever you like to call him as, governed China. And this was a period where politics in China was characterized by mass mobilizations, significant upheavals, and economic centralization under the state. Case in point being, for instance, the collectivization of people and the formulation of communes towards the later years in the 1950s, where Mao, through mass propaganda and also a pursuit of his ideological vision for China as in a revolutionary utopia and whatnot, basically instigated a series of reforms to the way cities are structured, but also villages are structured, such that people were concentrated in large communes with over, at times, hundreds of thousands of people living in each of these communes, responsible for large-scale industrial projects. One of the main projects that Mao pursued then was the backyard steel production. So the production of steel using incredibly low-quality steel furnaces. Now, Mao's target was effectively to supersede and overtake America and also overtake the Brits in the process of this industrialization scheme. Unfortunately, or rather perhaps fortunately for some, due to lack of actual technology and a poor quality of labor and the low human capital, the attempted reforms end up being utter disasters. Yet it was also during then that there were incentives on the part of local bureaucrats to disguise the fact that they can't meet the production targets, to therefore overstate their production goals, which led to an escalation in targets and a gradual decrease in actual individual rationing, because a lot of the resources in the villages was concentrated in production of such low quality steel. And a series of events therefore resulted in substantial quantities of deaths, which coincided, of course, with the 3 years of famine that took place between 1958 and 1961. But the gist of this great leap forward, as it later became known, was it evidenced the extent to which, or the extremity to which, Mao was able to utilize his cult of personality in mobilizing millions of people to participate in effectively what was a suicidal attempt to modernize and to industrialize. So not only is this great leap forward evidence of China's attempt to modernize and a failure to do so due to resource constraints, it's also evidence of how masses in China often react fervently to elite cues, especially cues from individuals with a cult of personality as strong and dominant as that of Mao. So that's just one example, of course, of Mao's China. Other events I think you shouldn't be able to talk about and understand in relation to China then would be the Cultural Revolution, of course, that took place or was ignited and instigated towards the later years of Mao. The first 5-year plan, which was the economic plan for modernization that was introduced right in the very beginnings of Mao's rule over China, and the series of movements that Mao initiated in an attempt to purge political opposition, or in his eyes, or in his language, corruption and reactionaries, or the capitalist roaders. These are all important references I don't think you need to know thoroughly, will be useful for you to use as examples in characterizing the susceptibility of China, at least back in the 1950s and 1960s, to mass mobilizations, often detriment. Of the public and the people. But that's obviously not contemporary China. As I said, this ended in 1976, which is basically when the Cultural Revolution died down, but also, more importantly, perhaps, the year when Mao died. Since 1976, China has undergone a series of economic reforms that saw the introduction of capitalism, or at least state-sponsored capitalism with Chinese characteristics. A very good book on that would be Huang Yasheng 2008, where he talks explicitly about China's trajectory post-1976 under Deng and under the various leaders I'm going to talk about next. What happened then between 1976 and 2018? China saw a series of turnovers and political transitions of power that were comparatively peaceful to the transitions of power under Mao. Why do I say so? Well, Deng rose to power after a long series of factional struggles, arguably against Mao himself, but also against far more conservative anti-economic reformists within China then. So Deng Xiaoping could be compared, I guess, to China's Gorbachev, except unlike Gorbachev, he took towards more political centralization as opposed to liberalization or democratization, which happened in Russia or Soviet Union under Gorbachev. So what Deng effectively did is he brought back the market and he attempted to purge a lot of what he thought were problematic strands of over-politicization, excessive ideological doctrinization from politics. And that was why he introduced the 4 modernizations. Modernizations in technology, modernization to the military, modernizations of the agricultural sector, and finally of the industry and more generally speaking, financial reforms and whatnot. So whilst Deng also brought back capitalism and put it back in the center of the Chinese economy, he was also fundamentally hesitant about devolving political power towards the masses within China. So that was why, despite the introduction of capitalism in the 1980s, we haven't seen exactly a transition to democracy as many experts hypothesized back in the 1970s or 1980s as would be inevitable in China as a result of the economic reforms and whatnot. But Deng's era of governance is characterized by both a mixture of authoritarian centralization of power, but also economic reforms and restructuring to ensure that, as opposed to being a state-driven or state-led economy with no room or space for privatization, at all, there was, at the very least, by the end of Deng's tenure, a sustainable and arguably booming capitalist market that deviated quite heavily from the economic vision of Mao Zedong. Since then, we've seen a series of leaders afterwards, like Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and currently Xi Jinping. And I think the central features of both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao that you should know and be able to talk about in debates is that they are what Saltman, 1992, would refer to as neo-authoritarians, i.e., they are individuals who believed in stability or thought stability was a prerequisite for China to access, in their words at least, long-term democracy and whatnot. Taken from a more value-neutral point of view, under both of them, China's economy expanded and achieved the highest rates of growth, especially during Jiang Zemin. But there were also allegations and concerns to do with corruption, political scandals of repression and oppression of distance and dissent, and finally, there was a fear of increasing rollback to democracy, at the very least, during Hu Jintao's tenure or the first 10 years within this millennium. Then Xi Jinping came to power in the 2010s. And that's when I would say Chinese politics took another different turn. And when you want to talk about Xi Jinping's China, you might think of the Economist headline, like, is Xi Jinping the new Mao and whatnot. I think there are three common features that you should take away regarding Xi Jinping's current rule over China. I'll talk about that in more detail later on. But firstly, is that he should not be seen as comparable to either Mao or Deng for the very simple reason that his vision for China is far more globalist or internationalist than either one of them. He perceives that the rising importance of China, given its stability, is to therefore take a lead in global governance or global affairs. And this is a characterization or framework that not even Mao, despite all his ideological fervor, ever explicitly flagged or ever explicitly upheld. So you might say this is a result of China's increasing global prominence. That might be true, but it's also an interesting observation in general about Xi Jinping's political outlook, that there is a disparity or distinction between what he believes and then practices versus Deng and Mao. The second thing to note is that Xi Jinping is not explicitly or overtly as only pragmatic and ideology-free as Deng, but nor is he as ideologically fervent and committed to doctrines as Mao. His enshrinement or his preachings at the various summits or the various plenums to the Chinese Central Committee have largely captured two main features. One, continued centralization of political power in the sense of ensuring that the center or Beijing had greater access to information or to politics and decision-making of localities and municipalities and provinces. But two, with the overarching goal of achieving economic modernization and connecting China with the rest of the summits or the various plenums to the Chinese Central Committee have largely captured two main features. One, continued centralization of political power in the sense of ensuring that the center or Beijing had greater access to information or to politics and decision-making of localities and municipalities and provinces. But two, with the overarching goal of achieving economic modernization and connecting China with the rest of the world. Now, modernization was a central feature in Deng's economic outlook, but I would say that what Xi is effectively emphasizing is the globalization and the interconnectivity facets of China's economic role to play. So that's the second observation I'll make about Xi. But finally, it's worth noting that Xi has taken quite an active approach in cracking down on opposition to his rule. So I'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about China and politics in general, but it's worth noting that these are the three main features that perhaps distinguish Xi from both Deng and Mao. And that moves me very nicely onto the second part today, on understanding China in terms of its politics. Now, the typical impression that most individuals would have about China is that it's an authoritarian state. That's largely true. I would add 3 points of nuance to that, however. Firstly, in that within this authoritarian state, there nonetheless remains some separation of powers. So it's not the Tocqueville-Montesquieu conception of division of powers. It's not exactly a very checked and balanced system that's like tripartite, as most Western political theory would emphasize. But it is nonetheless a division of power, at the very least between the party and the government. The party, or the Deng, controls in many cases, the more ideological and overarching vision-centric dimensions of policymaking, even on a local level, even within the villages, within cities, within towns, but also on a provincial and national level. Whereas the government, the zhengfu, the executive branch, focuses more on the implementation of this, or also this division of labor is supposedly to be that way. But in practice, of course, what the party system or the one-party rule in China means is that despite the division of power, the party occupies greater political importance than the executive branch. And that is why the party can often decide on how appointments within the civil service or appointments within the executive branch look like, despite the theoretical separation. So it's not a perfectly functionally divided or differentiated system politically, but it is an attempt to differentiate, at the very least, superficially between the executive and the party. You might ask, where's the legislature in this? Now, the legislature in China is composed of two organs. One of them is Renda, which is the National People's Congress. The other one, which is less official and not actually the official legislative organ, but we still call them like quasi-legislative, is a zhengxie, which is a CPPCC. It stands for, it basically is an organ that allows for so-called political mediation and negotiation between the executive and local representatives. Now, the issue with the legislative branch in analysis of Chinese politics, and the reason why we don't necessarily always talk about it, is it's quite ambiguous as to what exact role they serve. So on paper, they seem to be incredibly powerful. In actuality, Renda and zhengxie have often been characterized or seen by various individuals or academics who study China as a rubber stamp. So they endorse what the party says, they adopt what the party encourages them to take, and there are very few votes of opposition, or it's very unlikely that you would end up with like a major split, as you would see in arguably more democratically contested legislatures in general. The second thing to note here is we might increasingly hear, especially from Xi Jinping himself, but also from Chinese or pro-China academics, the turn towards rule of law in Chinese politics. To an extent, this is plausibly true. So there's an attempt in China to, at the very least, make legal education less ideological over the past 25 years, with a greater emphasis upon professionalizing the workforce, increasing the number of public defendants, liberalizing access to the legislature, and also not legislature, judiciary branch, but also ensuring that individuals who may not be able to afford legal representation otherwise can now be defended through pro bono offers or pro bono support, and shangfang institutions, which are institutions that allow Chinese citizens to report and to engage with high-level organs, to bypass lower-level judiciary organs if and only if they feel that they're not necessarily unbiased, and therefore to seek help from the so-called higher circuits, or the higher legal organs, judiciary organs, in arbitrating in cases of contention. So it does seem that China is technically pivoting towards greater rule of law. Like that might be true. But some say that there's also a concern that it's in fact rolling back into rule by law, because there's been an increase in unofficial arbitration rates in China over the past 30 years, especially at the turn of the millennium. There's been a sudden increase in the number of cases where arbitration is enforced. And you might think arbitration and mediation aren't necessarily, against the rule of law. What's wrong with that? But the problem kicks in when the individuals carrying out the mediation may not necessarily be legally trained, and many of them may in fact have political backgrounds or backgrounds completely unrelated to law. And that's also one of the main reasons why a lot of critics of China's current judiciary system are claiming that China is not actually advancing towards rule of law. The second problem that's arising is the tendency of Chinese officials to lock up and arrest Weiquan, which means pro-emancipation of rights or civil rights lawyers that campaign for causes or campaign for particular cases of victimization that cannot be currently redressed by the political system. So the increase in the arrest rates of these individuals over the past 5 to 10 years has been claimed by some as evidence that China's legal system is in fact rolling back its reform, and that's moving away from a rule of law towards a rule by law again, especially under the new government. So that's the general discussion we have concerning the authoritarian state and the extent to which that state has changed since 1980s and whatnot. The second thing to note is that there's a hierarchy in Chinese politics that you should know and be able to refer to in debates, but also just in commonsensical chat about Chinese politics. That is, you start with Xi at the very top as one of the members of a 7-member standing committee. And the standing committee is in turn elected by the Central Politburo, which is around 25 or so of the Central Committee members elected and selected to form a key organ of the state. And the membership of the Politburo is then drawn from the Central Committee, of which around 200 or so are permanent or full members, and another 100 or so are alternate members. And the Central Committee, along with all the layers of bureaucracy and the layers of committees above that, are all of them therefore compose or constitute the main leading legislative organ or the political organ that governs China on a national level. However, it's also worth noting that beyond what I talked about just then, in the sense that the party and the state overlap a lot, there's also an added nuance to Chinese politics involving what we call functional organs or vertical structures, what we call tiao, versus the kuai, which refers to horizontal and provincial and geographical government sectors. This sounds a bit abstract. Let me just break it down. So a tiao, or a vertical structure, refers effectively to a particular domain of government, say the financial affairs department, or the agricultural affairs, or transportation and whatnot. Now, since 1990s, China's moved towards a case where if you work in a transport department of a province, or a city within a province, or a town within the city, you would no longer be reporting to the central government of that city or town or province, insofar as reporting to directly the level above you in the very same functional specialization or the area of specialization. So if I'm a transport minister of a city, I'll report to the transport minister of the province, who then report to the transport minister of the entire nation, or at least of a particularly large region, and that in turn reports or feeds back to the central transport department in Beijing. What was the case before the 1990s then? It was a case where if I were working in a transport department, I would instead report directly to the central government of that very town or that very city, as opposed to going through layers of vertical reporting. So that means that effectively my responsibility, or the ultimate source of my legitimacy and mandate, lies with a locality prior to 1990s, but nowadays, since the 1990s, lies with the upper echelons of those belong to the very same functional area of specialization. Why is this important? This is important because I'd say it signifies a shift in Chinese politics from emphasizing cohesion between different departments and branches within the same city or province towards greater focus on specialization and working with those with whom you have functional synonymy and overlapping and similarity / symmetry in that sense. So you can see that there's a shift in how governance nowadays works in China. And this is obviously a nuance that not many folks would know about Chinese politics, but might be useful to bring up in general when you would talk about China. In terms of recent trends in Chinese politics, there are four things. One, you can see that there have been cases where, of increasing crackdown on corruption. You probably have read about them in Economist or in Foreign Affairs and whatnot. I don't have much to add on to that, but I would flag that it's worth noting that crackdown on corruption might not only be motivated purely by anti-corruption sentiments, but there's also a potential embedment of political factional intrigue and struggle in identifying those whom you would prosecute for corruption and those whom you wouldn't. I won't go into details here because a lot of that is largely speculative, but when you want to talk about, or when you want to debate someone who says, guys, look, China's becoming more accountable now because clearly it's cracking down on corruption, I think a very useful, countervailing claim for you to launch is to say, sure, but a lot of those folks arrested and cracked down upon for their alleged corruption are also individuals that are losing power or losing grip over power in a factional struggle anyway. So it's unclear the extent to which that crackdown on corruption is indeed so benignly motivated, if at all. Secondly, The second trend to note is the enshrinement of Xi. So Xi wrote himself into the constitution, or the party constitution, sorry. There's no formal constitution in that sense, but a party constitution that emphasizes Xi ideology and the importance of studying Xi thought. Which is why a lot of folks have said, this is something that Deng never did himself when he was alive, and only happened when Deng died. So surely Xi is trying to recreate the Mao cult. I won't comment on whether I think that is a legit interpretation. I will nonetheless say that this is perhaps a good point to note when you want to debate whether or not China nowadays is moving towards greater political liberalization. Arguably speaking, the enshrinement of Xi within the constitution is not a sign of liberalization, but it could also be co-opted by the side that's claiming it's evidence of liberalization by saying, look, it's precisely because of liberalization that the pro-liberalization ideology of Xi is now being written into the constitution of the CCP. So again, that's up for grabs. It's a characterization tussle. I'm not going to make a particular judgment concerning that. The third thing to note is we're not, and a debate in general, is there a shift towards greater meritocracy in China? Now, Andrew Nathan, 2003, wrote a very interesting article on authoritarian resilience, and he used China as an example to demonstrate that there's a greater emphasis upon meritocracy and the appointment of successors on authoritarian resilience. And a debate in general, is there a shift towards greater meritocracy in China? Now, Andrew Nathan, 2003, wrote a very interesting article on authoritarian resilience, and he used China as an example to demonstrate that there's a greater emphasis upon meritocracy and the appointment of successors and the appointment of new staff to the civil service in general. So these are the claims. He claims, therefore, that China is moving towards more meritocracy and less emphasis upon partisan ideology and whatnot. However, a refuting article to this from Jilly, I think in 2008, I might have to check the date for that, but I think it's 2008, claims that that is not true, because even in the Deng era, in the political econ reform era, there's still a lot of emphasis upon loyalty towards Deng and the reformists when selecting individuals for appointment. So again, I think this is an interesting trend that you can talk about when you're being challenged on whether or not China is moving towards greater meritocracy, despite the existence of national elections or national democracy. And finally, is there a shift towards greater democratization? There was a motion at Dutch Worlds 2017 that talked a lot about the idea of local elections in China. And indeed, contrary to popular belief, China is not a complete authoritarian state. There are local elections that do happen frequently and regularly. The only question, though, and a very important question, is to what extent are these elections democratic? So some say that their increased participation in politics, they tend to be unrigged and not necessarily, they don't tend to be rigged. Like, it's unlikely that these elections are rigged by those who seek to hold on to power, simply because there are many other more efficient and easier ways for them to cling on to power anyway. But there's also the countervailing claim that no, a lot of these elections aren't democratic because it tends to be clan leaders clan leaders as in leaders of lineages, of large families, or leaders of large corporations and local businesses, in fact, win these elections, even though there's technical, formal procedural democracy and there's no rigging involved. That doesn't mean that there's greater democratization, because those who can participate and influence and shape politics tend to still be those members of the very power elite. I won't make a judgment of which interpretation here is correct, but I think it's worth noting, therefore, that in debates about democracy in China, there's more to it than just to say, China is clearly apparently authoritarian state, or look guys, there's local elections, China is therefore democracy. I think there's a middle point in between those two positions that we ought to consider when we're talking about politics and political institutions. Let's now talk briefly about China in terms of society and culture. I want to cover the point of inequalities. I know I also want to talk about civil society, and you can see on the PowerPoint, but I'm afraid that we don't have much time. So let's just talk about inequalities in general in China. And I think there are three types of inequality that's worth flagging and noting. The first one, sorry, just grabbing some coffee. Right. The first one is the urban-rural inequality in China. That was bitter. Gosh, right. The urban-rural inequality of China sources from the fact that, naturally speaking, as with most other developing economies, China's urban areas and cities are developing at a rate that's substantially faster than the rate at which rural areas are developing. But that wasn't necessarily always the case, because back in the days of 1980s, in the early stages of reform, there was a lot more emphasis upon rural entrepreneurship, encouraging innovation in rural areas, but also the propagation of financial institutions and loans and microfinances and whatnot in rural China. All of that changed arguably at the turn of the decade into the 1990s, when a lot of economic reforms, or the attention of reforms, was once again placed upon urban areas, especially large dominant cities like those occupying the area near Shanghai. So we're talking about cities like Hangzhou, Nanjing, Shanghai, or in the Pearl River Delta, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and of course, neighboring cities like Zhongshan and whatnot. So there was a pivot in governmental attention and the attention of bureaucrats and civil servants and administrators and whatnot from the rural countryside to urban areas. And that was also what precipitated nowadays a massive wealth gap and income gap between individuals living in large cities or cities versus individuals living in countryside. To illustrate this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is true. The living standards in Shanghai, or the average GDP of Shanghai as a city, is comparable to that of any other major developed world cities. So the MEDC cities, it's probably comparable to like a city in the middle of a European country. Maybe not UK, post-Brexit or pre-Brexit, but probably in, say, continental, Mediterranean, or Eastern Europe. It's in fact probably slightly more prosperous than Eastern Europe in terms of Shanghai in that comparison. However, if you go to other parts of China and you head down to the countryside, like places in Gansu, or even places in rural Henan and whatnot, these are areas with substantially worse GDP and substantially lower income per capita, to the extent that many individuals still starve to this very day in these areas, where literacy rates are very low, where life expectancy is like 2/3 to 3/4 of that of individuals living in cities. So there's a massive urban-rural gap in that sense. And the second gap, which is linked to this, or the inequality that's linked to this, is the coastal-inland inequality, where coastal regions tend to be economically far more prosperous than inland areas. This might be the result of agricultural or climatic reasons, but I'm not going to go into detail of that because I'm not a political geographer. But I would focus instead on how FDI has shaped Chinese economic reforms and development since the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, and especially towards the end of it, large parts or large portions of coastal areas in China were transformed into special economic zones. These were zones that effectively attracted large volumes of foreign capital, trade, and whatnot, but did not obviously trickle down back into the inland or rural countryside within inland China. So that meant a lot of the investment coming from foreign investors, like the US, like Hong Kong, actually, back in the day. So back when Hong Kong was a part of the UK or Britain, Macau, Taiwan, whatnot. So there were large volumes of investment that went into China then. And a lot of that was concentrated. Over 90% of that was concentrated in these coastal areas. And whilst nowadays these special economic zones are no longer restricted to purely coastal locations, there's been a failure to redistribute income still from these prosperous, affluent coastal cities to the inland regions of China. And that is also what's been shaping a crisis that Xi Jinping himself flagged must be dealt with over the upcoming 5 to 10 years. So if you want to talk about the future trajectory of Chinese politics, it's worth bringing in these different types of inequalities to characterize or to buttress your characterization more. And finally, I'm afraid we don't have time to go into too much detail here, but I would flag there's also a massive gender gap in China, especially since the end of the Communist Revolution. Now, there are various theories that try to explain this, and I'll just focus on one possible explanation, which is on the second shift and the sort of economic rationality, RCT style, Becker style argument concerning division of labor and what happened during the reform era. Effectively, prior to the reform era, Chinese politics was structured in a way that allowed both women and men to work, and also often encouraged women to take up positions or jobs that were traditionally not seen as feminine. And being well aware of the fact that the concept of femininity is constructed and historically controlled by those who narrated Chinese literature, what Mao emphasized was that women should be allowed and permitted to perform jobs that are outside traditional gendered boundaries. Yet since the 1980s or since the 1976 and the end of the Cultural Revolution, that emphasis upon transgressing traditional gender norms has been that emphasis upon transgressing traditional gender norms has been, well, basically has been de-emphasized and de-escalated. And that's why there's been, once again, an increasing shift towards a focus on women taking up household labor and men taking up non-household labor. And this division of labor is obviously gendered, but it could perhaps be understood through the lenses of the fact that a lot of employers, since the end of the Cultural Revolution or since the end of the Mao era, have turned to prioritizing what they think or perceive to be the economically rational thing. And because of the way gender norms are constructed and shaped in China historically, that is why employers have what I would say is a misconception or perception that hiring men to perform traditionally masculine roles is the economically efficient way of maximizing revenue. And in an era where growth and income and where revenue is prioritized over everything else, that is why the employers, given such conceptions of gender, again, I don't think they're true, but given such conceptions of gender, have taken to prioritizing male employment in sectors that are, and indeed now have emerged to be traditionally now occupied by mostly men and not women. What are these sectors? These sectors include the STEM sector, the military, but also prominent positions within corporations. And an interesting trivial fact to note is that in the higher or the upper echelons of power within China, especially in the Politburo, no more than 10% of the members of the Politburo or the Central Committee are female. And the lack of direct representation of women remains a very core issue in China to this very day. So when you want to talk about gender in China, it's worth noting the inequalities that exist between genders in that sense. Finally, in terms of understanding China, in terms of the economy. So there's several key trends I'd like to talk about. Firstly, there's been a greater emphasis upon not only FDI, as I say in a PowerPoint, but also upon developing domestic demand. this happened in terms of domestic demand development towards the middle of the 2000s, right? So the past 10 years or so. And that's because the Chinese authorities realized that purely relying upon FDI was unsustainable or unreliable in terms of propping up a long-term economic growth of China. That was why there was a turn to stimulating internal demand that occurred in around 2005, 2004, that preceded the global financial crisis. And some say, in fact, that was why China was able to weather the global financial crisis, because it had a large enough self-sufficient economy that it wasn't entirely dependent on the stock markets or the financial markets in Wall Street and whatnot, to the extent it was able to shore up or like weather the storm relatively well. The second trend to note is the increasing focus upon exports and trade, as evidenced by the Belt and Road Initiative, and also China's increasing investment in Africa. If you're interested in reading up more about that, I would point you to Deng Fei, 2017, an article that he wrote on worlding developmentalism, which is a framework that he uses to analyze and discuss China's economic growth. So it's Feiding, F-E-I-D-I-N-G. And he talks extensively about how Chinese capital and domestic firms have effectively latched onto the state's projects and grand-scale collaborations with foreign countries as an opportunity for themselves to develop new clienteles and also new markets to export the goods to. So that's one way or one trend that you ought to be aware of in terms of Chinese economy. Finally, there's a transition into service or knowledge economy that some have hypothesized would eventually happen across China, but in most, or as analyzed by most analysts, currently is only happening to a select or limited range of cities, CF the coastal cosmopolitans, or CF the larger cities that have received the brunt of benefits from the economic reform. So there's a transition into service economy and a greater emphasis on human capital and technology. And this is obviously in response to the fact that there are now cheaper mass producers of goods or mass producers or of industrial products to be found in Southeast Asia, in Africa and whatnot. And China's losing its comparative advantage that it used to have, say 20 to 30 years ago, which is how cheap its labor was or how cheap the wages were. And that may no longer be its comparative advantage. And that was why there's a need and urgency in China's current pressure to transition into the more knowledge-driven and knowledge-centric economy. So that's the third economic trend to note when it comes down to China. So let's talk about China and wider concepts and trends in debating. So this is the second part of my presentation. How can you use China to illustrate a concept, even when emotion doesn't explicitly talk about China? How can you use it as an effective way of illustrating some grander political principles or concepts and ideas? I would note several things. Firstly, in terms of illustrating how competitive authoritarian regimes or how authoritarian resilience works, what does this mean? Now, authoritarian resilience is a concept coined by Andrew Nathan, but also developed by subsequently by a large number of experts, explain the idea of how authoritarian regimes can undergo economic reforms and liberalization without undergoing corresponding political democratization. That there's a resilience of authoritarian regimes in the face of the devolution, or at least the perceived devolution of power economically to the public. In China, this is particularly evidenced by the fact that despite the past 30 years of economic reform, there hasn't really been a high level, at least, or at high levels, democratization or opening up of the regime to mass participation. So if you want to illustrate a counter argument to the claim that trade or the claim that economic marketization leads to democracy, I think China is a useful example to use, but also that given the pre-existing things that we've discussed just then, you can even talk about the mechanisms through which the authoritarian regime survives as a result or because of liberalization. Firstly, because the improved living standards legitimize the regime. Secondly, because the absence of domestic economic middle class or domestically affluent middle class means that effectively the regime can bypass the local populace in gaining the capital required to sustain it. CF, the amount of money you pay to buy out elites, or CF, the amount of money you require to purchase high-end military technology. You don't need to rely on domestic middle class individuals, and therefore there's no leverage between domestic classes there and the government in the interactions. And third of all, perhaps even, in the fact that the introduction of foreign companies and foreign corporations have undermined the vibrancy or possibility for local labor unions to collectivize or to enshrine the rights of local workers. We saw this in the 1980s, where labor liberalization or the liberalization of labor-related laws meant that there was a decrease or shattering of the iron rice bowl of a lot of the workers in China, but in turn led to a rapid expansion in FDI and foreign trade and foreign investment coming into China. So these are all possible reasons why, despite economic opening up, there hasn't been corresponding political liberalization that we see in China. The second way in which we would use China in debating, I think, is in discussing a distinction between marketization and privatization. So this is close and proximate to what I talked about just then, but effectively, it allows us to talk about cases where you can have a market economy, where you can have a structure that emulates capitalist economies without privatization. Now, what does that actually mean? And why is this true in China? The reason why this is true in China is because despite the fact that the market systems themselves have been transformed from socialist state-planned economy or economic sectors into more capitalist laissez-faire sectors that abide by laws of market and competition and whatnot, those companies that do the best within the existing markets in China either have very strong state connections or are effectively owned by party leaders or party members that are very closely affiliated with the state. So yes, there's been a marketization and a transition towards private economy, but there hasn't been privatization per se in whom can access these large markets or whom can control these markets. In other words, the controlling power remains with the state, but the structures in which the state operates have become distinctly more capitalist and therefore opened up in that sense. So that's the second point that you can use China to illustrate. The final thing I want to talk about is when you want to talk about concepts of center-periphery tensions between a central government and the peripheral provinces or peripheral political powers and nations and imagined communities. Well, China and its relationship with, or the relationship between central China or the Chinese government and Tibet and Xinjiang, which are technically and formally parts of China, like that's when the relationship between them becomes quite relevant to the discussion. Because both Tibet and Xinjiang are areas that are currently autonomous regions. So there's technically and in actuality self-government. Some critics, however, voice concerns that there's been increasing Chinese encroachment upon local autonomy. I'm not sure about the extent to which this is true, but I think it is useful to say that, and it suffices to say that there have been radical tensions between those individuals on the ground in Tibet and Xinjiang who want to preserve their own way of life and they perceive to be incompatible with the central rule imposed upon in their eyes, and individuals both within territories but also within wider China who do want to see greater integration or greater imposition of control of the central authorities over Tibet and over Xinjiang. And this conflict of visions for these provinces and states have hence precipitated center-periphery tensions in China. And I think this is an example that you can use when you want to discuss wider concerns concerning ethnic relations and how multi-ethnic states should deal with demographic groups within its own borders. I think China's relations with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and also with the Buddhists in Tibet, or Tibetans in Tibet, would most definitely come to mind as a useful example to consider when you're trying to illustrate this point in debates in general. Let's now talk about Greater China in terms of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. In terms of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. So I'm going to be quite brief about them here, but effectively, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau are, at least from the point of view of CCP, parts of China. In particular, this is what's been described and enshrined or enforced as a case for Hong Kong and Macau. The case is a bit more ambiguous when it comes to Taiwan. Again, I stress this is formal CCP narratives. I'm not claiming that Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau is or are not parts of China. But that's effectively, at the very least, what the CCP claims to be the case. In the case of Taiwan, the current government in Taiwan is the Minjindang, which is the Democratic People's Party, or the DPP. But there's also not a dominant party that, in fact, was the original party that governed Taiwan for the longer end of 30 years odd, which is the GMD, the Kuomintang. Now, some of you may know that the Kuomintang used to operate in China. In fact, between 1911 and 1949, claimed to be, and was to a large extent, the official government that represented China. The 1945 to 1949 Chinese Civil War saw a 4-year struggle or contest between GMD and CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, for power in China. And at the very end of that 4-year struggle, the GMD evacuated the mainland en masse and moved to Taiwan. And there's a lot of emotional bitterness and contention surrounding this period of history, and it's very hard to be neutral about that. So I'll try and avoid touching upon Taiwanese history in that period. What we need to know is that contemporary Taiwanese politics is defined by 3 main cleavages or 3 main axes. Firstly, attitudes towards China. Secondly, attitudes towards what specifically Taiwan's relation, if it is indeed not to be considered as a part of China, should instead be in relation to China. And thirdly, in terms of the extent to which the government should play an active role in the economy. So there's a more pro-market dimension in Kuomintang and a more anti sort of market but pro-state, I wouldn't say interference, but pro-state subsidies and also big government sort of thing coming from DPP. These are three important axes and cleavages that define contemporary Taiwanese politics. And as you can see, a lot of this, or a lot of politics in Taiwan, seems to be inevitably closely associated with attitudes towards the mainland. Now, this is perhaps inevitable, given the very fact that Taiwan is literally only 30 minutes out by a boat's ride or a ferry's ride from Fujian, which is the province in China that's directly opposite it. And that's the straits between them, or the sea or the water body between them, has also therefore become a center of a lot of political and geographical tensions in terms of contests over territoriality, but also over the military exercises that Taiwan and China have both conducted within the Taiwanese straits over the past 30 to 40 years. The Sunflower Revolution, however, is a completely different matter in that the Sunflower Revolution took place in the early 2010s in Taiwan. And it was an attempt by youth politicians in protest against perceived inertia and perceived corruption in the Taiwanese government to protest against the Taiwanese government. And that was when it occupied the national legislature and they called it the Sunflower Revolution. Why do I bring this up as a political example or point to make about Taiwan? Because I think it's important to note that Taiwan is a democracy. And unlike China, it is a parliamentary democracy. And unlike China, it is a parliamentary democracy. And I'm bringing this point up because unlike China, it is a parliamentary democracy. And I'm bringing this point up because I've seen many individuals in debates accidentally or intentionally assert that Taiwan, because it's a part of China, has only recently democratized or is not really a democracy. That's a misconception, and that's a completely unwarranted misconception. Nonetheless, the Sunflower Revolution represents a lot of dissent and frustration towards the perceived inefficacy of democracy in Taiwan, especially the perception of corruption between some members of the government or some portions of the government and large corporations that basically dominated the local Taiwanese economy. That's the Sunflower Revolution in a nutshell. I don't want to go into too much detail. the local Taiwanese economy. That's the sunflower revolution in a nutshell. I don't want to go into too much detail there because obviously we're sidetracking from the main point of this discussion about China. But it's useful to note that Taiwan is a democracy and that unlike perhaps large portions of China, it is a parliamentary democracy because China also claims to be a democracy, but I would say is not a parliamentary democracy in that sense. The second item to talk about here is Hong Kong. So obviously Hong Kong has probably been at the brunt or the forefront of most folks' attention, as was recently at the very least, because of the umbrella movement that happened in 2014. But I think there's more to know about Hong Kong in that since its handover in 1997, there's been a rise in conflicts and tensions over several key issues in Hong Kong. One of them is how Hong Kong ought to interact with mainland China. So that's the axis concerning democratization, concerning political institutions, concerning whether or not Hong Kong, should preserve one country, two system, and the extent to which one country, two system is best preserved by the status quo. That's one dimension of conflicts in Hong Kong. The other dimension of conflicts in Hong Kong is more recent, I would say, and it's more identitarian. And it touches upon whether or not Hong Kong is a separate identity, an imagined community entirely from China. And this is where all the discussion and chat about Hong Kong independence has kicked in. Now, I'm not going to express a personal stance about this, but I'll just flag that what independence activists have called for over recent years is that Hong Kong, instead of trying to preserve the one country, two system institutions or institutions as per status quo, should aim instead for a complete severance and a complete movement away from China, a political detachment away from China, i.e. Hong Kong independence. Some say that the calls of the activists that call for independence are futile. Others say that this betrays the original purpose and objective of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And still, there are some, nonetheless, that say that the localist or the Hong Kong independence movement is precisely what is needed right now to break the political deadlock in Hong Kong. Personally, though, I would like to note that there have been severe criticisms of the localist movement, and this is useful to bring in debates in general, in highlighting how not only they are politically inefficacious, but also end up splintering existing opposition to China. In that since the rise of the localist fiction and movement in Hong Kong, we've seen increasing internal turmoil and reactionary resistance towards the more traditional pandem opposition to central government. So despite the fact that localism might be seen by some, especially members of youth, as a promising strand or path for Hong Kong, there have also been rising concerns that what localism and the calls for independence effectively actually do is they detract away from the more positive or more constructive pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. I won't make a judgment concerning which interpretation is correct, but it's useful to notice, especially if the other side brings up Hong Kong or the pro-independence movement in Hong Kong as an example and whatnot. But I would posit that it's so rare or so unlikely, I don't need to go into too much detail here because it's not going to be a main part of competitive debating. Finally then, on China in a wider world and international relations and how China positions itself in relation to its allies, partners, and whatnot. I want to talk about China in relation to several actors or several players as follows. I want to talk about Russia. I want to talk about DPRK. I want to talk about Southeast Asia. world in international relations. So unlikely, I don't need to go into too much detail here because it's not going to be a main part of competitive debating. Finally, then, on China in a wider world and international relations and how China positions itself in relation to its allies, partners, and whatnot. I want to talk about China in relation to several actors or several players as follows. I want to talk about Russia. I want to talk about DPRK. I want to talk about Southeast Asia and the US. Let's start with the US in backwards order. So US-China relations have historically been characterized by two forces. One is a competition or competitive sort of dynamic. That is the US-American fear of Chinese rise or the China's growth superseding or overtaking them, and the reciprocated Chinese fear that, as per what I talked about earlier on in terms of Chinese history and whatnot, that the Western Americans and colonialists are here to take over China or to oppress China. So it's a dynamic of conflict on one end. So there's a lot of tension embedded in there. On the other hand, however, we've seen a rise in emphasis and calls for cooperation, of greater collaboration and whatnot. And I'll just run through very quickly the different areas in which US-China relations are of significance. Firstly, in terms of economics. Now, China-US trade has, at the very least until the recent election of Donald Trump, been increasing in volume, but also been playing an increasing importance as a leverage for China against the States, but also as an opening window or a window of opportunity for the US to engage China. In fact, that's also the very initial window that brokered or facilitated the thawing of relations in the 1970s and 1980s between US and China. However, increasing concerns have arisen, especially since the 2010s, over things to do with copyright and China's protectionism and American protectionism, especially under Trump. And that is why the talk of a trade war has become increasingly prominent over recent months. Risen, especially since the 2010s, over things to do with copyright and China's protectionism. And American protectionism, especially under Trump. And that is why the talk of a trade war has become increasingly prominent over recent months. I don't think that China and US's economic relations would ever descend into a full-blown trade war, for the very simple reason that there's too much interconnected interest right now between both American firms and Chinese firms and the Chinese government to ever allow a trade war to happen. However, there are worrying signs to suggest that there might be increasing tensions and increasing retaliatory measures that may involve local or partial protectionism from China towards the States and the US towards China, especially given the nativist or the nativist and protectionist outlook as advocated by Donald Trump. So that's the sort of economic sides of things. And I don't think, in short, that it's likely that China and the US would ever enter full economic deadlock and full economic trade. I don't think that's likely given the calculus of the legislature, the Congress and states, but also of politicians in China who have a lot to lose from a trade war with America. But the second dimension here is the political. And as we can see, there are lots of flashpoints for China-US relations to do with the South China Sea, to do with Japan, but also the Korean Peninsula. And I'll talk a bit more about the Korean Peninsula because I think that's worth chatting about in context of recent events. Now, some folks say that China's vision for the Korean Peninsula is for a total victory of DPRK and for a total conquest of South Korea. I think that's an invalid and implausible reading of China's motives. And that's for the very simple reason that the increasing trade between South Korea and China, but also the symbolic importance of South Korea's autonomy to US-China relations, means that China is not likely to ever support a full-blown military invasion or even a partial invasion of South Korea by North Korea. And indeed, over recent years, we've seen China's calls for greater thawing of relations and restoration of discussions and negotiations, bilateral discussions between North and South Korea as mediated or moderated over by China. So in terms of the political flashpoints, China has no incentive to push for an escalation in tensions in the Korean Peninsula and whatnot. It's difficult to tell where not the same applies to US. So this is not a discussion or a lecture about US DPRK relations, but I would observe that recent signs seem to point us towards a more optimistic conclusion. But I would remain nonetheless cautiously optimistic because it's very hard to tell what Donald Trump is exactly thinking. In terms of politics, though, the overall trend in terms of US-China relations is an increase in proxied conflicts or proxy tensions or clashes between the US and China over territories such as South China Sea, Japan, and the peninsula and whatnot. And finally, in terms of the cultural and ideological. Now, Joseph Nye talked a lot about the idea of soft power. And more generally speaking, I think he quite rightly observed last week at a talk in Oxford that despite all the fanfare that China's propagated, China's soft power and cultural influence is still far secondary and far subpar as compared with the US. But increasingly, we've seen attempts from China to produce and construct a counterculture or a form of resistant culture that tries to react to, and if anything, hopefully from the eyes from Chinese leaders, supplant that of the American Hollywood cultural hegemony that's dominated cultural discourse in the world over the past 50 to 60 years. The extent to which this is successful remains to be seen, but it's not hard to see evidence of state-sponsored cultural production if you go on Chinese media like Weibo or like WeChat, where there have been large volumes of China or Chinese state-produced media content that attempts to undermine the dominance or monopoly in their eyes of American culture over cultural landscapes in, say, Africa, in Latin America, and whatnot. So there's a lot of prospective tensions or clashes over culture that may emerge as flashpoints over the upcoming 2 decades or so. I don't think I can speculate, or at least I can do anything beyond merely speculate about this. We would flag that these are three dimensions that would shape and influence the way we analyze and understand US-China relations for the years to come. Now let's talk then about DPRK and North Korea, because I've discussed this quite briefly just then. I would just like to note that China is the largest trading partner of North Korea, and bilateral trade between the two is a prominent source of economic revenue for North Korea. However, that's one hand. On the other hand, China has also supported limited and restricted, but nonetheless still important sanctions towards North Korea. In 2006, China supported the UN Security Council Resolution 1718, which signified a turning point in China-North Korea relations, because back then, or back in the days, Beijing was never keen, or had never been keen up to that point, on sanctions or retaliatory measures towards North Korea. But since 2006, we've seen an increasingly stern outlook in terms of how Beijing has been treating and viewing North Korea. Two interpretations of this exist. One interpretation is that China needs to become more globalist and globalized, and therefore is forced to abandon, or rather is pressured to abandon due to its opening up to partners around the world, forced to abandon its old existing ally in North Korea, so as to not offend prospective new trade partners and whatnot. The second interpretation, which may be more plausible, is that North Korea's instability, or North Korea's repeated nuclear testing and repeated refusal to listen to Chinese instructions, has rendered North Korea, in the eyes of China, a ticking time bomb. And that is why since 2006, China supported more punitive mechanisms and measures in an attempt to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table in that sense. So China-North Korea relations are not entirely kumbaya. If anything, they're very far from purely being kumbaya and ideologically motivated. There is a dimension of cooperation and support on the part of China, but there's also a dimension of increasing sanctions. And what does China want in this? I think there are two things. One, limited instability. China wants instability in the sense that some instability is conducive towards its maintenance of regional influence and leverage, especially when it can say to America, look, I've got control and leverage over North Korea and you don't. But China also wants this tension or instability to be limited, because the potential refugee crisis or the nuclear fallout or the military disasters that might ensue if North Korea spun out of control would be excessively costly, especially given North Korea borders China alongside the northeastern states in China, what they call the Dongbei Sansheng. So these are areas of potential flashpoints and tensions that China wants to minimize the probability of conflict in. So on one hand, China does want some conflict in the area, but on the other hand, it also wants the conflict to be limited and restricted. I think this is a useful point to make in future debates you might be in concerning North Korea and China, or heck, even about the Singaporean meeting between Donald Trump and Kim that took place literally just last week. So that's China and North Korea. Finally, let's talk about China and Russia very quickly. So China and Russia have very close ties in terms of military cooperation. So that's China and North Korea. Finally, let's talk about China and Russia very quickly. So China and Russia have very close ties in terms of military cooperation, but also energy codependence. But more importantly, though, I would observe that there are increasing reasons why China and Russia might have issues with each other, or increasing potential points of conflict or flashpoints. What are they? Firstly, in Central Asia, China's vision is to incorporate Central Asia into its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia's vision is to incorporate Central Asia into the Eurasian Economic Union, and at very least to maintain influence and leverage over the area. Note that these two goals are probably incompatible, because Russia is not likely to join Belt and Road, or even if it did, become a major partner or a major part of it. What does this mean? This effectively means that the competition over influence over Central Asia could become a reason for greater Russo-Sino tensions in that sense. The second tension point concerns Far East Russia, where, yes, Chinese investment within the region has steadily increased over the past 20 years or so. But at the very same time, Russia wants more from China. For instance, it wants the investment to listen to local political or bureaucratic orders, and at least be more cooperative with local governments and whatnot in the far east of Russia. That hasn't been a condition that Chinese investment or investors have relented or conceded to. So there's an ongoing tension over who controls what the investment is used for, and whether or not China is in fact using the investment purely in a more benign philanthropic way of supporting an ideological ally, or whether or not China is actually using it to maintain leverage over Russia. So there's a nice dispute or discussion over there within academic circles. And a final thing to talk about in terms of Russo-Sino relations is potential tensions over the Arctic, where China has shown an increasing interest in investing or exploring the Arctic Circle. But historically speaking, Russia has been extremely protective of its territories and areas of control within the Arctic Circle. So potential tensions over the Arctic Circle may arise, not necessarily over the next 5 years or so, but over the next decade and over the next 2 decades. Arise, not necessarily over the next 5 years or so, but over the next decade and over the next 2 decades between Russia and China. I think that's something we ought to be on the lookout for, and might be interesting to flag in debates where Russo-China relations or Russo-Sino relations may come into play and come to the forefront. So that's basically Russia and the discussion of China's foreign relations wrapped up in that sense. Now that we've covered all of this, I want to move on to the Q&A section, which kind of signifies the end of my rant or monologue. But before I do so, or actually, we'll now do so, are there any questions that I can answer concerning China? Anything? Well, I'll just remain online for another 5 minutes to see if there are any questions that may come in. Do you have any questions? And if you do have any questions about debating China in general, or China as a whole, please do feel free to let me know. We can have a chat about that on Facebook or via email, or if you're into that, Google Hangouts or Google+. Thank you all for listening in, and seeing as no questions, thank you all for listening in, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. Have a lovely evening or afternoon, wherever you're at, or morning, in fact. And yes, see you soon. Bye, folks. And a failure to do so.
Hola, Mat Lovers, bienvenidos a Descubre.
Okay, so we've started. Hi, everybody. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be discussing a little bit about how we debate and analyze religion. So I'll start with a brief disclaimer, which is obviously there are many different religions, and the kind of guidelines that we're giving here are very, very broad and kind of very much personally based on my experience, specifically my experience growing up in a religious household and going to and having religious education, and also living in a fairly religious country, and also kind of how then that kind of experience meshes with the sort of analysis that I tend to hear inside debates. So to put this very shortly, this is what I'm saying here is often true of religions, but there are going to be many different religions where this is simply not applicable to, and maybe even some of the religions that I'm closer to, which are, which is Judaism and Christianity. There are also going to be certain issues which I'm not going to touch upon, and it's not just that they're not important; it's just that we don't have a huge amount of time. So please, nobody be offended by anything which I might say here. And please do feel free to comment if you think that I'm missing something here. So the most important thing, I think, when coming to discuss religious belief is to be able to define what it is that religious belief is. And specifically, what it is that differentiates religious belief from other kinds of belief. So for instance, there's a motion which often gets bandied about, which is this house prefers a world without religious belief. And if you're OG and you're discussing this motion, then you might want to stop and think for a second what it is that necessarily means. Because for instance, there are lots of other kinds of different beliefs that we have, some of which might seem and think for a second what it is that necessarily means. Because for instance, there are lots of other kinds of different beliefs that we have, some of which might seem very much religious. So for instance, belief in rights or some kind of deontological principles. It's unclear what the difference is between these and religious beliefs are. The same is true of simply belief in nationalism or other kind of abstract concepts that we have. So I was OG in this motion, and very luckily I happened to have someone who's much smarter than me, who had Monica Foreman, and she came up with this particular tidbit, which is essentially saying the difference between religious belief and other kinds of belief is the difference between belief and belief. And that means that in religious in belief, you have something that you believe in about the world. For instance, I believe that it is now raining. And if I go outside and it's not raining, then that belief can be informed and updated that it is no longer raining. This is the difference between this and a belief, which is, for instance, the belief in God. And no matter what gets told to me or what kind of proof is given, I will continue to believe this irregardless. Essentially, this means that a leaf is something which isn't connected to anything in the physical or the metaphysical world that we reside in. It is inherently a spiritual concept, meaning that it isn't something that is then informed by practical implications. No matter what kind of mathematical proof is shown to me, I can continue to believe in God. So if we compare that, for a second, to other different kinds of belief, so the belief in utilitarianism, for instance, there can be a belief in I should make the world better for other. I should make the world better for other people, and I should sum up the happiness that exists there. So, for instance, I can inform someone's belief of if they believe in utilitarianism that something won't make somebody happier by showing them, look, here are people who are unhappy when we implement your proposal, and then their belief can then be informed by that, and they can change it. Even more so, we can maybe, for instance, there can be a belief in I should make the world better for other. I should make the world better for other people, and I should sum up the happiness that exists there. So, for instance, I can inform someone's belief of if they believe in utilitarianism that something won't make somebody happier by showing them, look, here are people who are unhappy when we implement your proposal, and then their belief can then be informed by that, and they can change it. Even more so, we can maybe say that we can point that if we're talking about utilitarianism as a whole, we can point to simply happiness as not necessarily being the thing which is most important to other people, to change them from, say, utilitarianism to a rights-based or a different kind of other kind of based moral groundwork to work with. The same isn't necessarily true of religious belief. Then we have stuff like deontology. So here it's important. So there, for instance, the belief in, so there it's a little more complicated, because essentially deontology said we believe in a certain right, or we believe in a certain something is true, no matter what the consequences are. This is an absolute truth which cannot be changed. So here, what is then the difference between this and religious belief? I would say there isn't. I would say that essentially deontology is a form of religious belief. And it's important to note that Kant, when proving deontology, or if you think that he doesn't prove deontology, essentially says, when he gets to the point where he's trying to prove this, relies on God in order to prove that these are principles which transcend the mundane world that we exist in, which obviously sounds familiar to you guys, that it's simply, again, something beyond the mundane world into the spiritual. It is essentially a godlike belief. So essentially, to sum up everything that we've just sort of said, if I have a belief in something, there can be an empirical outlook in the world which can change the way that I believe in something. If I have an belief, and specifically a religious belief, then I believe that it is an objective truth, regardless of anything in the world that might be pointed to, which means that it is something that can't necessarily be changed. This, you might already begin to understand that this then kind of means that there is maybe less ability to compromise or change people's minds or create other kind of compromising systems that we talk about when discussing other beliefs, when there is somebody who simply cannot be informed or changed of a certain belief that they hold. And this is the very first thing when we begin to talk about religious belief. And to go back to the motion that I was talking about, this house prefers a world without religious belief, the case that we then ran was then analyzing what it then means to have to believe in something, and why we prefer a world where people can compromise in what they believe in, why we think that it is more likely to be abused if you cannot point out that people are wrong, and all these other kind of things which stem specifically from something which we think distinguishes between religious belief and belief. So that's the very first thing that we're talking about. The second thing that I think is important to talk about when we talk about religion is to say something quite simple. Religion is not a choice. So again, we're going back to, this stems from the first point that we're talking. Talking about, but it's important to note because a lot of the time I hear in debates when discussing people's religious rights, a lot of people, not just debaters but people as a whole, seem to be fairly dismissive of people's ability to have the right that they believe in, and specifically point out the fact that people can simply choose not to do this. So if we're talking about a ban on hijabs, or we're talking or other kind of religious symbols in other places, it tends to, people tend to often run lines that people can simply choose not to wear a hijab, much like someone can choose not to wear a shirt or any other kind of clothing. And here is where I think it's important to note that this is simply not the same and not comparable. So if we go back to the issue of saying that someone who believes in their religion his mind can't necessarily be changed, and it's important to note here what they believe in. So specifically, when someone believes in a religious practice, such as the wearing of a hijab, the wearing of a kippah, the wearing of a cross, or any other kind of religious practice, they think this is the word of God, right? They believe this is the word of God. They believe that this is the word of God. This is something that is necessarily true and necessarily right. To not do this is therefore something which is horrendous and horrible to them, much in the same way that we might think that killing someone, not to put it very, very strongly, would be a terrible thing to do. Because as far as they are concerned, religiously and morally and imperatively, they have to do this certain thing. And to force them to do otherwise is not giving them a choice to do so. So notice, for instance, that this then informs all kind of analysis that we tend to have on people's religion. For instance, or banning religion in public places, or for instance, there was a motion in the Euros a while ago about bombing religious sites and whether this would be something that we would permit people to do. And the case run there claimed, in the same way that we do not allow people to poison wells or scorch farmland or deny food and water to people in a time of need, we cannot allow people to have in their time of need, not have access to religious sites and to religion. Because for these people, their religious beliefs are more important than life itself. And again, from almost every single religious outlook, there is a belief in something beyond the world, beyond the mundane, which is more important than what happens here inside a practical world. And again, if we look at this historically and we can think about this, there have been people who have been willing to die for their beliefs time and time again. This was true in the Crusades of the Muslim population who were willing to die rather than convert to Christianity. This was true during the times of the Inquisition during Spain, and this was also true in China with Christian communities under pressure there. Time and time again, people have proven that they are willing to die rather than give up on what they believe inside their religion. Now, all of this means that we should then take quite a fair bit more seriously people's religious choices and people's religious belief than otherwise said. Having said all that, I'm now going to contradict it completely. Because the third thing that I want to talk about when discussing religion is that religion is permutable. As in, religion does change. So for people inside a religion, there is often, again, as I said, the idea that the religion that they have and the practices that they're doing is the word of God and is something that is being handed to them and is the objective truth and cannot be argued with. So up until now, I've been talking from inside a religious belief. Now I'm going to step outside of my household and go into the world that I currently live in, which is a more secular belief, and say that the religion that we practice, all religions that we practice today have obviously changed over time and changed immensely. The religion that we practice today is obviously incredibly different to the religion that was practiced 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, right? So Judaism has changed completely, Christianity has changed completely, Islam has changed completely, Hinduism has changed completely, Buddhism has changed completely. So this means that religion can change, and this means that also probably isn't necessarily the objective truth. The question is, though, if people currently today believe that what they are practicing is the objective truth, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to compromise. It doesn't necessarily matter. Again, you can point out to them that their religion has changed, and this is probably not the word of God, because if it was the word of God, then we would be practicing religion the same way it was practiced 2,000 years ago. But it isn't necessarily convincing to them, because again, this is a question of belief versus belief. But when analyzing religion in debates, we can discuss how it is that we can inform and change religion. So there are two main ways historically that religions have been changed. So one is the way that they are affected by the practical. So by the practical, I mean that in the way that technology has changed, that states have changed, that all kinds of like physical implementations have changed, means that religions have changed as well. So for instance, Judaism used to be most of its rules used to have to do with farming, because all of the things that they would do were to farm. Now that Jews are no longer mostly farmers, there are many, many different rules and accords which have to do with trading, with bartering, with running businesses, and with doing all kinds of other things which simply didn't exist at the time when farming was the main thing that Jews did. This means that when we change laws and the world changes as well, then religious belief and religious ability can change. It's also important to note that most religions have changed with the regimes that they exist. So for instance, when we look at the Vatican and we look at the Pope used to be accepted that the Pope was beyond any kind of law and the papal state was beyond the monarchs and the kings of Europe and could make any kind of decree and had its own courts and its own system, and it would be unthinkable that you could try somebody that the Pope wanted to try inside a regular judicial court. Then at the end of the Middle Ages, the kings in Europe got together and decided that they would quite like to try people in their own courts, thank you very much, and took away this power from the papal state. Notice that there had been accords and religious beliefs which proved that it was necessarily impossible for someone that the Pope wanted to put in trial to be tried anywhere else. 100, 200 years after the fact, after this had changed, these accords were no longer in effect, had been changed, subsequent popes had changed them and had slowly eased them out. And the same is true of other major religions interacting with political states as well. The fact is that religions, though they might claim to be spiritual and unconnected to the mundane world, are quite obviously interacting with the mundane world with practical effects on a day-to-day basis. And so when we want to discuss changing religious belief and changing minds, it's often important to remember that we can change this by changing laws and changing rules as well. We have to then show why it is probable that the religions will change in accordance, and we'll get to that later. Before that, the other thing I want to discuss is the other kind of ways that religions change, and that is simply from being influenced by other kind of ideologies and other kind of belief sets as well. So obviously religions beget religions. This we know. So Christianity is a certain kind of was sprung up from Judaism, as Islam also was heavily influenced by both of these religious sects, and other religions as well have also been influenced by other religions and gone their way. But the other thing that they're also influenced by is other kind of ideological beliefs as well. So for instance, like the Greek philosophy of Aristotle and Plato has had a huge effect on all of the major religions, and they've incorporated certain beliefs from these canonical texts into their religious systems and into commandments as well, and into religious commandments as well. And the same is true of ideas, for instance, of nationalism. So nationalism is something which is slightly foreign to religions, because it says that it says that people are not. So, for instance, if you're a religion such as Christianity, which claims a global sphere and a global sphere of influence, so nationalism is something which is kind of goes against that sort of belief, because it necessarily separates us into different groups. But for instance, there have been many different meldings of nationalism to Christianity. In Spain and in Italy and in other countries as well, nationalism and religion have been influenced by one another. And there's also been decrees made that, for instance, that the word of the king or the word of the ruler is holy because they are there by divine right. The Romans too, which Jeff Sessions so recently used to try and justify taking away immigrant children at the border. All of these kind of religious commandments say that we can then use different ideological beliefs and marry them into our religious system. What then is the way that this happens? And when is it likely that either a practical implementation, such as a change of law or a change of technology, or an ideological implementation, such as a new ideology spring up, is likely to affect religions and likely to have an effect on it? So the first thing is to note that there is more choice inside religions for the leaders of that religion and the spiritual leaders of those religions, rather than the mass followers. So again, we're going back to a debate that we might have about banning religious symbols inside public areas. It might be made, a point might be made that for the vast majority of people inside this religion, there is no choice. They believe that they must wear this religious symbol, and you are taking away their right to do so. It's important to note that in most religions, however, there are people, spiritual leaders, who have a closer connection to the text and a closer connection and ability to therefore interpret and change the text as need be. So one of the lines that often gets made is a realpolitik kind of line. It is it in the interest of the leaders of this religion, who have the ability to change the text, to incorporate the change that we want to make? So is it in the interest of the religious leaders in France, for instance, to allow, specifically of the Muslim community, to allow a ban on Hajj? Probably not. But that is somewhere that we would want to start analyzing to prove that this is something that maybe in the long term can change over time. The other thing that is important to look to is, are there places inside the spiritual text that can be interpreted to incorporate these different religious beliefs and these different religious ideas? So thanks to the sprawling nature of the religious texts and the fact that they are so large, it's often very easy to find different sets of passages which can be used to justify different bits, different laws in the future. And again, this is what rabbis and imams and priests do every single day when they're reinterpreting the text. So it's important to note: is there somewhere that we can base this kind of change that we want to make religion on in the text? Even better, if you can, is to, if you know the religion particularly well, is to look for a certain sect or a group or a certain mainstream interpretation of this text, which already incorporates elements of the change that we want to make inside the religion. Because then obviously it is more likely that this change can happen if there is already been changes made like this in the past to that religion. It points to the plausibility of this happening again. And again, note that this is something which leaders can make a change to, which the day-to-day followers often can't. So the other thing to note here, when we talk about how the religions change, is to analyze what this religion is. So up until this point, I've been talking about religions in a slightly homogeneous concept, as in, so when I talk about Judaism, I'm talking about all of Judaism, Christianity, all of Christianity. That's obviously not true. Like, there are different groups inside religions and different sects inside those religions as well. And obviously there are different numbers of people inside each one of those sects. And there is a different strength of belief and a change belief inside these different sects. So for instance, I'm going to just go with Judaism because it's what's easiest and most approachable to me. So inside Judaism, roughly, that you have the ultra-Orthodox, who are Indians, and different sects inside their religion as well. And obviously there are different numbers of people inside each one of those sects, and there is a different strength of belief and a change belief inside these different sects. So for instance, I'm going to just go with Judaism because it's what's easiest and most approachable to me. So inside Judaism, roughly, that you have the ultra-Orthodox, who are the also known as the black hats, who are the most stringently religious people and have the most stringent rules. Then you have what we call the national religious group of people who are religious and who necessarily have and necessarily do follow rules, but not as stringently as the ultra-Orthodox and are more open to interpretation. Then you have a group of people who we call traditional, who observe certain rules, things which have to do with family and home, and see the religion as something which brings their family and home together. And then, for instance, you have people who are completely secular. This is even without going into the fact that you have Reformed and Conservative and many other different groups as well. So if I were to analyze religion in Israel and trying to make a change in Israel, I would be talking about these different groups, and I would be talking about which of these groups are most likely to change. So again, let's take a motion here. Let's take a motion about about separating church and state in Israel. So there are groups. So when we talk about the ultra-Orthodox, who are the most stringently opposed to any kind of changes to their religion, it is most likely that they are the people who are not going to change their minds, and would therefore probably not be people that we could change inside this debate. Then we talk about the national religious, people who are more open to interpretation, and there we would want to specifically analyze who are the leaders of these religions. are, why they are likely to be close to the state, why they are likely to gain specifically from the from this separation, why it means that they will expand maybe their power over the people inside their religion, because they no longer have to parley with the state about making religious decrees, because they can simply make the decrees themselves. And then we can talk about the traditional, who we can say are probably not going to be affected by this very much either way, because the kind of traditions that they want to upkeep regarding family and home are things which are likely to remain even with a separation of church and state. And then we can point to we can say this is therefore something likely to gain support if we can specifically change the minds of the national religious parties and their leaders. So that's sort of the example of what we would want to do when discussing how we can change religion and change religious minds as well, even if we think that this is something which for the majority of people involved in it, their minds can't be changed overnight and can't be changed based on negotiation or facts. I'm going to have a look now to see if there are any questions regarding what I've just said before continuing. So I'm going to now sum up the stuff that I've talked about so far. So we began with the idea that we simply cannot, that the thing that which differentiates between religious belief and other kinds of belief is the idea that this is something that can't be changed based on mundane practices or based on some kind of ability to show people that they are wrong and inform them of their opinion. We then moved on from there to discuss how the idea then means that for the majority of people inside religion is simply not a choice for them. It means that they believe that what they are doing is mandatory, and to take away this right is something that we need to weigh very very heavily when we decide to do so. And then the final thing that we discussed is the idea that, having said all of this, it is possible to change religion over time. And obviously, factually, this is true because religions have changed. And therefore, we need to discuss what are the different ways that we can change religion, how the ways that practical differences can inform religions and change them, and also the way that ideological differences can inform them and change it, and how by looking into the different subsets of the religion and breaking it down from some homogeneous group into the different strands of religions that which exist inside it, and also the difference between leaders inside that religion who have access to text and access to the ability to make changes and access to politicians most of the time versus a basic believer, and weigh up the differences there. That's all from me for now. So thank you very much for theological differences can inform them and change it, and how by looking into the different subsets of the religion and breaking it down from some homogeneous group into the different strands of religions that which exist inside it, and also the difference between leaders inside that religion who have access to text and access to the ability to make changes and access to politicians most of the time versus a basic difference between leaders inside that religion who have access to text and access to the ability to make changes and access to politicians most of the time versus a basic believer, and weigh up the differences there. That's all from me for now. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully see you again soon. Bye.
Let's start. So you had 4 debates today. A lot of you are tired. I bet there are a lot of people who aren't even here because they're already sleeping. A lot of you who are here look like you had a rough day. You're wearing pajamas. You look very tired. Obviously, that's not good.